Alright, so Unit 9 covers something that we know a lot about just from elementary and middle school science and just general knowledge, and that is plants. So plants are Kingdom Plantae. They are part of the 4 eukaryotes: plants, animals, fungi, and protists. They are multicellular, they are autotrophic, which means they get their energy automatically from the sun, and they have a lot of the same systems and functions that animals do. So the levels of organization go from smallest to largest when we always look at them. So let's start with cells. A bundle of cells that do the same job are going to be labeled as a tissue. A bunch of tissues that do the same job are organs. A bunch of organs trying to perform the same job is an organ system. And finally, a bundle of organ systems is going to be the full organism. So for example, in plants, flower, leaf, stem, roots, those are organs. Root system, everything below ground. Shoot system, everything above ground. Those are systems. There are also other systems in a plant, like the vascular system, which is very similar to our circulatory system, that we move blood, they move water and food and sugars and stuff. They got a reproductive system, which is just like ours. They are trying to fuse a male and a female gamete, and they have response system. For us, we call this the endocrine system, our hormones. We'll be talking about one big hormone, but it's for growth, protection, hormone systems. It's basically responding to their environment. Now, I know you are sick of this because we have literally beat it to death in like 4 videos at this point. We gotta know the products and the reactants of photosynthesis and cell respiration. Remember, reactants are over here on the left, products on the right. Photosynthesis and cell respiration are going to flip-flop their products and reactants. As you can see here, glucose and oxygen become what you need in the next one, and what you needed in the first one, CO2 and H2O, become what you give out in the other one. The only difference is we went from using sunlight as our energy source to creating cell energy ATP. That's the whole point of the thing. We didn't really destroy any water or CO2 or do anything weird with it. We just created usable energy in the form of ATP. So plants are going to perform photosynthesis by absorbing sunlight, mostly in the leaves. They got this guy right here, the chloroplast that is in the leaves, that usually gives leaves the green pigment that you see. That's why plants are usually green, the chlorophyll in the chloroplast. You're gonna need CO2 and water. You're gonna create your sugar. Remember, they're autotrophs, they can make it. So they make their glucose, they give out some oxygen, and then those 2 things are used in the mitochondria. Every single cell in a plant has mitochondria, but only photosynthesizing cells have a chloroplast. So if they're not going to perform photosynthesis, like root cells, for example, they're brown and they're underground, those are not photosynthesis cells. So they're not going to have the chloroplast. They are still going to have mitochondria because every single cell has this guy. They use that glucose, they use the oxygen, and they spit out the CO2 and the water, and then we get our final ATP. In order to make biomolecules, we need to have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Our biomolecules need very specific elements to make them. Carbohydrates and lipids need CHO and CHO. Proteins, however, need CHO, N. They need that extra nitrogen. Nucleic acids need the nitrogen, but also need a phosphorus, so they're even more complex than a protein. If I can't get these elements from my carbon and nitrogen cycles, I'm not going to be able to make these biomolecules. If my carbon cycle isn't going to work and for whatever reason my photosynthesis does not function properly, this carbon never gets into the cycle and it gets broken right here. So now I have no way to get C to any other organisms, and they need those for all their biomolecules. So plants are absolutely essential for the carbon cycle because of photosynthesis. They're important for nitrogen cycle as well because we have the nitrogen stuck in the air, and then we have these little nitrogen fixing bacteria hanging out down here in the roots of legumes, which are like beans, peanuts, stuff like that. Without those guys, I am stuck in the cloud of nitrogen again, which means none of these animals over here, cow, mushroom, other plants, they can't make protein or nucleic acid, because those are the 2 that I need nitrogen for. I can make the other ones, I can make carbs and lipids just fine, but if nitrogen cycle gets broken here, proteins and nucleic acids cannot be created. So once again, plants are very essential in these cycles because they help recycle them and move them from one step to another. So now let's talk about tissues. Tissues are a bunch of cells working together to perform the same job. A lot of times they'll look very similar because structure determines function. Big tissues that I want you guys to know. The first one is going to be the dermal tissue. Consider dermal tissue like the human epidermis, which is our skin. It's going to be the bark, it's going to be the outer covering. It's mostly for the protection. You also have ground tissue, which is right inside that layer. It's just inside the dermal layer. It's kind of a tissue that goes all the way up and has a little bit of storage, a little bit of structure. You also have meristematic tissue, which is what a lot of these cells divide from. First thing to sprout in a bean is the roots. And then after that, everything in the meristematic tissue can become the rest of the shoot system and leaves and everything else. Consider it kind of quasi-plant stem cells. Those are the things that everything is going to derive from. It has to be able to create all its structures from the initial tissue. Because initially you have a bean that only has roots. If you put a bean in the ground and it starts to germinate, there's no leaves yet. So it has to have a little bit of stored glucose to get the roots going and get the meristematic tissue going. Then once it grows some leaves, then it can go through photosynthesis. So beans and seeds, when you plant them, are only going through cell respiration. Until they get those first leaves, they can't grab the sun. And then finally, the most important tissue, I think, for this unit is the vascular tissue. This is your xylem and phloem. So if you look at this picture here, the xylem is these little tubules that kind of go from the roots all the way up to the rest of the plant. They transport water and stuff dissolved in water like minerals, but it's a one-way street. It's also passive, which means it's not going to need energy. This is why if you stick celery in the colored food coloring, like you probably did in elementary school, the celery will start to pull colors up, so it'll start to turn red or blue or whatever you stuck it in. This is going to happen naturally because it's osmosis of water. Phloem, however, is going to move sugars and glucose and food and a lot of the bigger stuff that's not going to zoom through the xylem. It is a two-way street. I can push sugars or glucose all the way to the top of the plant, but I can also push it all the way to the bottom. This is because I would need sugars in my flower at the top as well as in my roots at the bottom. Because I'm pushing against concentration gradients and I'm going from our low to high, just like we learned in active passive transport, this is active. I'm going to need ATP for movement against the concentration gradient with phloem. The vascular tissue will largely make up what's called the transport system. It's basically how stuff gets around. Again, if we compare it to humans, this is just like our circulatory system with arteries, veins, lymphatic vessels, all that stuff is kind of like the transport system in plants. Now, since xylem is a one-way street, roots are going to continually suck water up. And if it has too much water, it has to get rid of it out of the leaves. There's these little pores on the bottom of the leaf called stomata. They're these little openings that can open and close. They can let gas and water travel through them. Gas exchange is needed for photosynthesis. You know that we need to be able to move CO2 in and oxygen out. And also, since we can only go one way on our xylem, if we're pulling up a bunch of water from the soil, we have to be able to spit it out of the leaves. This is called transpiration. You can actually put a Ziploc bag or some kind of plastic wrap around a leaf and watch it for a while, and the bag will actually start to fill up with water and condensation. Because as you water your plant, if the plant doesn't need that water, it kind of sweats it out through the leaves, if you want to think of it like that. It's not to relieve heat like sweat is in humans, it's actually just to get rid of it and balance out the water. When these need to get rid of something, they're open. They're opened by the guard cells, which in this picture are the little purple things around the red stomata. And when they need to conserve gases or fluid or something, they're going to close up the stomata and seal it tight so we don't leak out water. These are all, again, on the bottom of the leaf because of that waxy layer on top of the leaf called the cuticle. It's made out of a lipid because it's a wax, so water can't get out the top of the leaf, so the stomata are always going to be on the bottom of your leaf. This transport of water and sugars is actually a great system. Stomata and vascular tissue make it a lot easier to get nutrients. It also lets the plants grow taller. Stuff that's not super evolved, like mosses and algae and stuff that lay on a rock that are real small and flat, they don't even have developed vascular tissue. They cannot grow tall like a pine tree. A pine tree can spit water all the way up from the roots to the very tip top of the pine tree. Stuff that's small and low to the ground is like this because they don't have the developed vascular system of Xylem and Phloem, which helps the taller plants move stuff around. Next, you get into the reproductive system. For plants, this is the flower. The flower is actually the reproductive system of plants. The flower is colorful and pink and purple and blue because it wants to attract animals to this part right here, the anther. This is where the pollen is created. This actually right here, the anther and this brown stick below it, the filament, are the male parts of the plant. Sometimes people will wrap up anther and filament and call it the stamen. This is the male part of the plant. Flowers can actually have male and female parts. Now, this is cool because they can self-pollinate. They don't have to go far to find pollen or to find another ovule, but it's bad because they're going to make pretty much a clone of themselves, which doesn't increase the diversity, which means that plant isn't going to be strengthening its population by diversifying. So say some bug, let's say a bee, is brought in by the pretty pink flower and it brushes up against the anther and it flies a mile away to some other flower. I don't know. It may accidentally bump up against the female part of another flower, which is what the flower actually wants. The pollen's going to get grabbed by a little sticky part up here called the stigma. Then it's going to travel down the style, which is this tube, and it's going to enter the ovary. These are the female parts. Inside the ovary, you got the ovule. In humans, we call the gamete sperm for males and eggs for female. In plants, we call the gamete pollen for males and ovule for females. Humans combine sperm and egg to make a zygote. Plants combine pollen and ovules to make a seed. The seed can grow into a full organism just like a zygote can in a person. Once that ovule is fertilized, the ovary and all the surrounding tissue will develop into the fruit. So here's the reason why fruit is sweet. Fruit is full of sugar because it wants animals to eat them. It also wants animals to eat the seeds, run 10 miles away, and then poop it out in a pile somewhere, because that means that seed has been able to travel and spread its genes and change the populations around it without being able to move. It wants animals to eat the fruit because then they could accidentally transport the seed to a faraway place that it never would have been able to get to without that animal. All of the female parts, stigma, style, ovary, ovule, are sometimes called the pistil. So we got the stamen for the males, the pistil for the females, and then the other stuff is kind of common for most flowers. You got sepals, which are these little bitty leaves underneath the ovary. A lot of times they're green, but sometimes they're not. The thing is, they're just going to try to protect the ovary. They're actually going to be closing everything up before it blooms. The receptacle is where the ovary actually kind of meets the stem. It's the transition period right around the sepal area, where the ovary becomes the stem, and then down the stem there's leaves. So the stem and the leaves aren't really part of the reproductive system. That's where you kind of get down into the rest of the shoot system and the vascular system and everything else. Up on top of the flower, its main goal is reproduction. That leads us to our last system, which is the response system. Like I said, the response system is governed by hormones, and there are a lot of hormones that deal with fruit ripening and stem elongation and branch splitting, all kinds of stuff, but we're going to focus on one hormone called auxin. This is the main plant growth hormone, and we're also going to focus on 3 main tropisms. A tropism is a response to a stimuli of a plant activated by this hormone, auxin. These are actually pretty easy. You just look at the first part of the word, it tells you what it responds to, followed by tropism. Phototropism, it's going to lean towards the light. A plant will actually lean towards the light and find sunlight because it can absorb more in the leaves and get brighter sunlight, more direct sunlight. It's called phototropism. Plants will also actually grow their stem up and their roots down because they actually know where gravity is. They will sense the force of gravity. Stems will grow against it, roots will grow with it. So like if you were to even draw these roots here, once we flipped this pot right here, these roots would actually flip direction and start trying to find out where down is, because down for them means water. So they're always looking for more water. This is called gravitropism, responding to gravity. Now be careful. Sometimes they will also call this geotropism. It just kind of depends where you read it, but they're the exact same thing. Gravitropism and geotropism are responding to the force of gravity, telling them what is up and what is down. Finally, you get thigmotropism. T stands for touch. Plant is going to bend towards a solid object or some kind of touch stimulus. It's responding to the touch. When a plant that needs to coil and vine hits something, it's going to wrap around it and climb up. When you touch a plant that needs to close, like a touch-me-not or a Venus flytrap, it's going to respond to that touch by closing. This is how a Venus flytrap catches a fly. It responds to the fly touching the little hairs and little stimulus responding cells inside the Venus flytrap, and it closes it up. And the more finely tuned these tropisms are for plants, the better they're able to survive. The more they can actually respond to their environment and not die, the better and the stronger the plant is going to be. So even though we don't think of plants as intelligent beings like humans or something, they're actually going through the exact same process humans are. They're constantly evolving, they're constantly changing through natural selection, because their entire point, just like humans, is to not die and reproduce and make sure their species survives.